Ned Kelly has become an integral facet of the Australian mythos. Depicted widely in pop culture since his hanging in 1880, the manner in which the Kelly gang is portrayed has shifted and evolved over the last 140 years. This can perhaps be most exemplified by Australian cinema, wherein he who was once a Robin Hood figure synonymous with the oppressed working man has come to be seen as more of a fugitive, defined by murder and malice. So why is it then that our national cinema has chosen an outlaw as its poster boy for what it means to be Australian? Heading back to the early 20th century, the Australian socio-political landscape was a vastly differing one from that of today. Off the back of the Eureka Rebellion, aversity to British rule sparked anti-establishment sentiment which permeated society in the decades to come. Thus, the tale of Ned Kelly's spars with the law and his now famous Jerilderie letter of the late 19th century could not have been better timed to emulate a notion echoed within Australian society. In 1906, the Tate brothers made the story of the Kelly gang inspired by the Great Train Robbery, which in many ways idolised the bushranger ideology and Ned Kelly. Film historian Ina Bertrand describes the film's tone as one of sorrow, depicting the last of the bushrangers. Examples of this include a scene whereby Constable Fitzpatrick attempts to kiss Kelly's sister, to which he bravely saves her, or Ned Kelly begging for troopers to spare his life, a request they, of course, deny. This idea can be analysed further under Siegfried Krakauer's theory on national cinema. By scrutinising the films of post-World War I Germany, Krakauer posited that the rise of Nazism and nationalism could be seen in the aesthetic and storytelling of the period. Films of this time centralised on one theme, which in many ways foreshadowed what was to come, the soul being faced with the seemingly unavoidable alternative of tyranny or chaos. Though Krakauer's beliefs were limited to Germany, this psychological model of national cinema explains early Australian films' love for the Kelly gang, in that it reflected an underlying societal mass desire. Skipping ahead to 1920, nothing much has changed. World War I and the blasé and disdainful treatment of Anzac soldiers had only cemented anti-British and thus anti-establishment notions in the mind of Australians. So much so, in fact, that Harry Southwell wrote, directed, and produced 4 feature-length films portraying the Kelly gang story. However, amidst this similarly tense political backdrop, the landscape of the Australian film industry had shifted dramatically. Beginning in 1912 with the banning of all bushranger films in New South Wales, by the year 1917 the Commonwealth Censorship Board had been formed to enforce restrictions on cinema at a federal level. With Henry Wollaston at its helm, the CCB saw it as objectionable to depict acts as simple as embraces which overstep the limits of affection, or blasphemy and anything offensive to an ally of Great Britain, or, more significantly, anything demonstrating indifference to breaches of the law. Under these strict guidelines, Southwell's first film slipped through the cracks by displaying a PSA warning against law-breaking in its opening, though his other films were not as fortunate, each of them banned for glorifying bushrangers to the point in which he eventually gave up mid-production on his 4th attempt. So why do this? Stephen Gaunson writes about how these restrictions destroyed Australian cinema, as foreign films depicting very similar things were allowed screening in the country, whereas local productions were not. Well, Benedict Anderson's notion of the imagined community helps to explain these seemingly counterintuitive actions by the Commonwealth. Anderson argues that it was the creation of media which can be consumed by the masses as far back as the invention of the printing press, which ultimately conceived nations as we know them today. This occurs as individuals are born into imagined communities, in which their morals, beliefs, and mannerisms are unified with one another, dependent on the media which they are, as a collective, exposed to. Patriotism is intrinsically linked with national cinema, as Australian-made films have sought to differentiate themselves from the Hollywood juggernaut by appealing to an Australian audience with markedly Australian ideas.
Dad? $4.50.
For jousting, Sticks. Tell him he's dreaming.
Thus, it becomes clear that the CCB's actions were seeking to manipulate Australia's imagined community and its innate values away from anti-establishment sentiment, that of which is embodied by bushranger films and the Ned Kelly story. It was not until the 1940s that the bushranger ban was relaxed, leading to the release of the Glen Rowan Affair in 1951. The film similarly glorified Ned Kelly and the bushranger ethos, but was critically panned and hardly distributed, perhaps the first indication that the bushranger film was losing its popularity. Fast forwarding to 1970, the big screens were graced by Mick Jagger's acting debut in Tony Richardson's Ned Kelly. This film depicted Kelly in a somewhat differing fashion, however. It is established that Kelly has had a harsh upbringing and is largely noble, yet misunderstood.
3 years imprisonment. If your son Ned were here, I'd give him 15.
Nonetheless, the film does depict Kelly as a murderer and immoral character, disparate to its predecessors. In many ways, this film can be seen as the turning point in the portrayal of the Kelly Gang narrative. The next two iterations of the Kelly Gang story on the big screen take on a significantly different tonality. Both Reckless Kelly and Ned satirize the bushranger genre in a light-hearted and comedic fashion, Ned being the most profound in its message, mocking Ned Kelly's status as a hero in the Australian mythos. The tide had well and truly turned.
Nobody move or I eat the Weetabix!
The box office flop of the same year, starring Heath Ledger, almost typifies the fall of the bushranger genre in Australian cinema. Without the underlying spark of anti-British dissidence being a pertinent aspect of our national identity, it seems the Ned Kelly story no longer captivated audiences as it once did. True History of the Kelly Gang, released in 2019, utilises the misrepresentation of the Ned Kelly story as a narrative device, in writer Peter Carey's words, shaking up the notion of myth-making.
For a myth is more profitable than a man.
Unapologetically unfaithful to the truthful sequence of events, this film is in many ways a comment on the way Ned Kelly's tale has been exaggerated and moulded to align with certain ideologies.
May we not find someone better to admire than a horse thief and a murderer?
And so, a tale which was once a vehicle of sedition and insurrection has become just another mere form of nationalist iconography, utilised to unify Australians under some imagined sense of community which benefits the very powers Ned Kelly once fought against. As Andrew Higson argues, in considering cinema in terms of cultural identity, it is necessary also to pay attention to the processes by which cultural hegemony is achieved. The power to institute one particular aspect of pluralistic cultural formation as politically dominant, and to standardise or naturalise it.